forward. Assuming that the viewers today have not read the article, lay out your case in short form.
Well, the 11 report is a 650-page document, and to put that in as short a hand as I can possibly make it, what they're saying is that late in 2006, Goldman Sachs realized that they were sitting on a time bomb of toxic mortgage assets, that they conspired to unload those assets on their clients and then bet against them at the same time. And then later on, the report also sort of lays out that in the process of investigating this issue, the Senate questioned Goldman. They also had testimony in Congress, and it lays out that they believe that Goldman lied about some of these activities.
Lying to Congress. Matt, you've been on this case long before a lot of people thought. I mean, one might think you've got some kind of an issue with Goldman, but you definitely think they've done something wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think how anybody could read this report and not see that Goldman definitely conspired to sell assets that it itself did not believe in on unsuspecting clients. I mean, one of the great emails in this entire document came after they sold $100 million worth of a deal called Timberwolf on an Australian hedge fund, and they're celebrating afterwards, and one guy says, "We found a white elephant, a unicorn, and a flying pig all at the same time." In other words, we found the ultimate sucker. And this kind of stuff is all throughout the report. If I could just jump in there, Ali, there's definitely a legal standard that requires an investment bank like Goldman Sachs to disclose adverse elements to the deal. Like, for instance, that they had a $2 billion short position against the same stuff they were selling. Okay, so let's spell that out. Let's spell that out. You're saying that they had a legal obligation to tell somebody they were selling an investment to that they had a $2 billion bet against that investment.
If I could actually also jump in here,
let me jump in just quickly. Goldman actually in that deal even said affirmatively that their interests were aligned with the client because they had a $6 million stake in that same deal, but they didn't disclose that they had a $2 billion bet against the deal. That's the kind of thing that went on. Well, I've read all the documents in this report, and I've also talked to some of the principals in this entire story. I definitely know that some of the clients that Goldman was talking to were completely blindsided by the fact that, for instance, they were buying assets out of Goldman's own book when they were told that Goldman was buying these assets off the street. They definitely did not make key disclosures that they were legally obligated to make.
Megan, I think Matt wants to see a perp walk, wants to see somebody from Goldman arrested for something or charged with something. What do you think has to happen? Because clearly, whether or not you think Goldman broke any laws, any of us who followed this got the impression that they perhaps were not dealing in the best interests of some of their clients.
I think that they probably aren't, just like most vendors aren't always look to their own interest before the interest of their clients. But here's the thing, I think that there is a real desire to have a sense of closure on this, a desire to track down a villain, figure out who did this to us. And I think that really underweights the power of human stupidity. Greed, stupidity, and poor system design can produce really terrible results even without anyone doing anything illegal.
How are you not ashamed to do the job that you do? How are you not ashamed to apologize for these billionaires who ripped off ordinary people? I can't believe that you
These weren't ordinary people. A hedge fund is not an ordinary person.
Well, no, how about this?
I can't believe that you've met hedge fund managers and
from Morgan Stanley, which then in turn took a $10 billion bailout from the taxpayer. Ergo, they ripped us off. How do you answer that?
How do I answer that? I think that, in fact, they do deals with big banks. There's questions about how we should have done those bailouts. But the fact is, it's not Goldman Sachs' responsibility to make sure that Morgan Stanley makes money.
Yeah, I mean,
any more than it's the Atlantic's responsibility to make sure that Rolling Stone makes money.
That's a good point. I'll just leave it right there.
I don't know how that makes sense on any planet in any universe. That is just insane.
Last word to you, Megan.
Well, I think that it's very morally satisfying to try to track down people who did things to us. But I think in the end, justice wants to make a case that Goldman didn't just do something that we don't like. They want to make a case that Goldman did something that was actually illegal at the time when they did it. And that's a lot harder standard to meet. In fact, in the aftermath of these crises, what you get is a lot of cases brought that fail. Elliot Spitzer didn't make his cases.
The report tells the inside story of an economic assault that cost millions of Americans their jobs and their homes while wiping out investors, good businesses, and markets. Risk lending, regulatory failures, inflated credit ratings, Wall Street firms engaging in massive conflicts of interest contaminated the U.S. financial system with toxic mortgages and undermined public trust in U.S. markets. It's the longest report that our Committee has ever released. It comes at the end of the longest investigation that we've ever done, over 2 years. It is a bipartisan product of a bipartisan investigation that was bipartisan every step of the way. The threads that run through all of the chapters in this sordid story are conflicts of interest and extreme greed. The story starts with the largest thrift, WAMU, or Washington Mutual, selling tens of billions of dollars in dubious and often fraudulent mortgages, either directly or through mortgage-backed securities, creating a veritable conveyor belt of shoddy loans and mortgages, and in the process, polluting the U.S. financial system with junk assets. The next chapter is about a federal regulator, the Office of Thrift Supervision, OTS, seeing the danger, but sitting on its hands instead of acting to oversee a bank on which it depended for 15% of its budget. The page then turns to credit rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, which were giving AAA ratings to high-risk securities, securities that were issued by firms that it was dependent upon, that they were dependent upon for their own business, which also was a clear conflict of interest. And when the securities collapsed in value, leaving pension funds and municipalities and other investors, they were all left high and dry. The final chapter of this book looks at investment banks, mainly Goldman Sachs, that created a huge market for shoddy mortgage-related securities, then packaged and sold them using deceptive practices, placing bets, huge bets, and placing secret bets against the very securities that they were selling to their clients and making big money when the house burned down.
I agree with Senator Levin that a significant conflict of interest led to this precipitous change in our country and in our economy. And they could have been identified in advance, but conflict of interest led to a lot of poor decision-making. And lack of transparency also led to a lot of poor decision-making. A lot of what we see in this report, had there been transparency, would have never happened.
Then you've got another but for the failure of our regulatory agencies, in this case the Office of Thrift Supervision, because of the failure to supervise the bank after 500 notices of problems, doing nothing until we had the largest bank failure in history by far. But that failure, this problem may have been avoided, this collapse of the mortgage market. May have been. So it's a contributing factor. There's not one factor, there's a number of factors. But for the conflicts of interest, which caused our Standard & Poor's and Moody's, who people rely on when they see AAA ratings, but for their failures, their conflicts of interest, their caving in to the pressures from Wall Street banks to give AAA ratings to securities which didn't deserve them, and they knew it. For that, you wouldn't have had the collapse of those securities. But for the greed and the misrepresentations, the deceptions of banks such as Goldman Sachs, you would not have had securities which not only failed, but which drafted their own clients. But the failure of those securities in the hands of pension funds, municipalities, when they all failed, you had a housing market whose collapse was just about, I won't say total, but huge. So you got, I would say, just in this report, you've got 4 major causes of the economic collapse.